This session is now being recorded, and we'll make sure that the recording is available to all registrants after the webinar. All attendees have been muted by default to minimize background noise. If you do have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will address as many questions as we can during the Q&A portion of the session at the end. If you experience any technical issues, please let us know in the chat and our team will try and assist you as best they can. And finally, we encourage you to stay engaged, and with that, we can get started. So I'm so glad that you could all join us today for the special information session on behavior change for the environment, hosted by UC San Diego Extended Studies. My name is Stefania Randazzo-Wright, and I'm a program manager in the Science and Sustainability Department at Extended Studies. Before we dive in, I would like to take a moment to introduce UC San Diego Extended Studies for those of you who may be new to our community. We are the continuing and professional education division of UC San Diego, offering practical, career-focused learning designed for working adults. With over 4,900 courses and programs in everything from data sciences to the arts, we serve more than 30,000 learners each year, helping individuals grow professionally, pivot careers, and make an impact in their communities. We're especially proud to offer accessible, flexible learning that reflects the most current knowledge in today's job market. Now, turning to sustainability, which is the topic of today, our topic is part of our Sustainability and Behavior Change Certificate, which is a program designed to help learners understand the psychological, social, and cultural drivers of behavior. Whether you're working in environmental policy, education, urban planning, or corporate sustainability, this program gives you the tools to design effective strategies for real-world impact. Behavior Change Strategies for Sustainability is one of the 2 courses that is required for the certificate and one of our most popular courses. This class focuses on the strategies and tools needed to change individual behavior and promote environmental protection. So with that, I am thrilled to introduce our moderator for today's session, Dr. Kayla Cranston. Kayla is in fact one of our instructors in the certificate too, and teaches co-designing conservation along with our conservation psychology class. Kayla will be moderating the session today with one of our other instructors of the program, Dr. Jennifer Tabanico. Kayla and Jennifer will be guiding our conversation today and helping us explore more around strategies for promoting sustainable behavior with a special focus on community-based social marketing. So with that, Kayla, I'll turn it over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I'm excited to see everybody here today and really grateful to be a part of this with Jennifer and everyone here. So again, my name is Kayla and I do teach one of the courses in this wonderful certificate program. I'm very honored to be able to introduce today to our speaker. Is there? Okay. Can you all hear me okay? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I'm honored to introduce Jennifer Tabanico, our presenter for today. So there's a lot you should know about Jennifer. And one of the things is that she's been doing this work for approximately 20 years. Jennifer has a master's in experimental psychology. And I think one of the more impressive things is that she is now the president of Action Research, which is a consulting firm that was founded about 25 years ago, I think, and has been doing this kind of work, applying psychology and experimental psychology practices towards environmental topics and all of that. And she'll tell you all about that, I'm sure, for a very long time now. And Jennifer also teaches UCSD's Behavior Change Strategies for Sustainability course, which she's going to give you a little taste of today, where I believe she specifically is focused on waste and transportation and other types of environmental topics. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you all to our speaker today, Jennifer Tabanico.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Kayla, for the introduction, and to UCSD for having me. And thank you all for being here. I know this is a really busy time of year for many of you at the end of the fiscal year, starts of summer vacation. So I'm so pleased to see so many of you here today for this hour. So my interests, like all of you, are interested in environment and sustainability. Obviously, you're here on this webinar today. My interest in environmental issues goes further back than 20 years, actually. This is a photo of me at 5 years old. And one of the things I really loved to do was go to the zoo. I loved learning about the natural environment and the animals and was just really excited about that from an early age. The other thing I was really excited about from a very early age was human behavior. So what you can't tell from this photo is that what I'm actually sitting on is a trash can that's shaped like a large kangaroo. And the trash goes right there in that trash pouch. And so this was one of my favorite trash cans. But what I really liked about the trash cans was looking into the trash cans to see what other people were putting in there. I was just so interested in what other people were doing. And my parents tell me that if I could not stop and look into the trash can, that I would throw these horrendous and embarrassing tantrums, and they would just let me just stop and look. So you could argue that maybe I learned to change behavior, at least on the part of my parents, at a very early age as well. So fortunately, I've been able to take this passion through my academic and professional path and turn it into a career where, as Kayla mentioned, I own and operate Action Research, where I've been able to apply insights from behavioral and social science to develop outreach programs that promote safe, healthy, and sustainable communities. So all we work on is behavior change, and in particular, behavior change that benefits the environment, health, and public safety. And I've had the opportunity to apply that knowledge across a wide range of topics and audiences. So everything from waste and recycling to pollution prevention, agriculture issues, conservation and biodiversity issues. I've really had the opportunity to work with different audiences as well, from youth to business owners to farmers. And so the frameworks and strategies that I'm going to present to you today are really broadly applicable, no matter what area you might be working in, what behaviors you might be working in, or what audiences you might be working with. So one of the first points I really want to make is that behavior matters. And it's pretty widely known and accepted now that many of our environmental problems are the cause, or at least linked to, human behaviors and decisions. So climate change, biodiversity, habitat loss, plastic pollution, water pollution, erosion, waste generation, the list goes on. Many of these environmental problems are actually, at least in part, behavior problems. Human behaviors, decisions, and actions are contributing to those problems. And largely, a lot of the way we think about addressing environmental problems has been through technology and infrastructure. Let's build something to fix it. And this is really actually very effective. If we can create more efficient technologies, electric vehicles, for example, we can greatly reduce CO2 emissions. Yet there's still a role of human behavior when we have technology. People need to adopt the technologies, and they need to use it correctly. So if we have a smart Wi-Fi thermostat that can really help people to reduce the energy use in their home, but if they don't install the thermostat and program it to settings that are going to use less energy, then we're not going to actually save any energy or reduce emissions as a result. Similarly, there's new technology that will use AI to help people sort things into the right bin, the right recycling bin in public spaces. But if people don't stop and hold their item in front of the scanner and then place it in the right bin, that AI is not fully effective. So we really, even when we have these technology solutions, we can't ignore the role of human behavior. And that's also true of infrastructure. If we build bike lanes, it doesn't necessarily, people are going to just start riding their bikes. There may be other challenges in the way. One of the most recent examples of this is current programs with curbside collection of organic waste or food waste. We've got the infrastructure, here's the program, but how do we now get people to participate and divert their food waste from the landfill? So it can't ignore human behavior there. The other approach to addressing environmental problems has been through policy or law. So through policy, we can create a landscape where we're just removing the problem. So bag bans, for example, or not allowing single-use plasticware. But it takes time to get those policies in place. They can address the problem effectively, yet the time it takes and also the public support that it takes. So what we can often do is get people engaged on a voluntary basis first while those policies are getting in place. It buys us some time and also generates support because some people are engaging in those voluntarily. You may think back, for many years, we were bringing in recyclable or reusable bags into the grocery store before they were then removing plastic bags or charging for them. And that's similar for laws as well. We can enforce laws, and that can be very effective if people are going to be fined or otherwise punished for not engaging in the behavior. That can work, but it takes a lot of time or a lot of effort and resources to enforce those types of actions. So think of littering, for example, or illegal dumping is very difficult to enforce because you've got to catch people in the act. So even with these other approaches to environmental problems, which I don't want to ignore because they're all important, we really need to be thinking about also the role of voluntary actions, both by themselves, but also to support the technology and other approaches. So how has voluntary behavior change traditionally been addressed? Well, if we look back historically and even currently, the vast majority of programs take what we call an information-intensive approach. And this is really takes one of two paths. One is a knowledge-based approach, and that is we basically assume that people aren't acting because they don't know what to do or they don't know about the importance. So we educate them and we provide flyers and we conduct workshops and we create websites and social media posts with the hope that if people just knew what to do, they would certainly do it. But what the research is clear in showing is that simply having knowledge about how to do something is not sufficient motivation to act. While knowledge can be a barrier that prevents action, there are often other motivations that need to be addressed. The second approach is more of an attitudinal approach. And this is approached as, well, people just don't care enough. So we create materials that are intended to heighten concern or change attitudes. So we may show people seabirds with their abdomens full of plastic and hoping that will build empathy and people will care and that will translate into action. But what we also know from many studies is that simply having a favorable attitude about something doesn't always translate into behavior change. And so programs that are only focusing on changing knowledge or changing attitudes are rarely effective at fostering changes in behavior in the long term. And I think that we can find some evidence of this likely just in our own lives. So we're all on this webinar, we care, we have likely favorable attitudes about environmental behaviors. Yet I think that if we were to go around this virtual room, and I won't put anyone on the spot, I'm sure that we could each name 4 or 5, maybe even more behaviors that we know are important, yet we don't do them for some reason. I'll be the first to confess, I have a difficult time remembering to bring my reusable bags to the grocery store. I still drive a gas-powered vehicle, and I drive it to work as a single occupant. There are many other things that I don't do, despite knowing about their importance and their impact on the environment. There have also been several studies looking at this. I will share 2 of my favorites. The first is a study that was done in 1981 by a gentleman named Scott Geller at Virginia Tech. And he wanted to look at the relationship between changing knowledge and attitudes, and ultimately, does that translate into behavior change? So what he did was advertise in the paper an energy conservation workshop that was about 3 hours long, in which the first 40 people who signed up for this workshop, could come and learn about low cost and no cost things they could do around their home to save energy. So as you can imagine, these people were probably pretty motivated because they were signing up for a lengthy workshop. They're one of the first 40. They're excited to learn about it. They already probably have pretty favorable attitudes about this topic. And they're going to spend, the program managers are going to spend 3 hours with them. And most of us who are working and delivering programs rarely have a few minutes, let alone a few hours with our target audiences. So this is sort of the most extreme case of delivering a knowledge-based campaign. So what he found is that following the workshop, people had more favorable attitudes about energy conservation and were generally more knowledgeable about the things that they could do in their home to save energy. But when he followed up to see did behavior change, he found that just one of the 40 people who came to the workshop actually followed through and lowered the temperature on their hot water heater. They were shown how to do this in the workshop, and it was a relatively simple action. Didn't take a lot of effort and didn't cost a dime. Yet only 1 in 40 did that. Slightly more encouraging was that 2 out of 40 installed a wrap around their hot water heater. This is a much more involved action. It involves a purchase and installation, and 2 followed through. That's kind of impressive, yet they later found out that both of those individuals had installed that wrap prior to coming to the workshop. So those results were disregarded. The most impressive findings from this study were that 8 out of 40 installed a low flow shower head after attending the workshop. Now, that's a great action because you not only get the energy savings associated with heating the hot water, but you also get water savings as well. 8 out of 40 did that. We could celebrate it, except that becomes less impressive when I tell you that all 40 of those highly motivated participants were given a low flow shower head at the workshop. So despite having knowledge and positive attitudes and the equipment, only a small portion of them ultimately followed through. So often what people say at this point is, well, what if we just had a bigger budget and we just talked to more people and we just got the information out further? Well, there are many examples of large-scale national programs that have done this. And one that you might recognize, this comes from the health field, but that's the 5-A-Day campaign. This was a nationwide campaign that started in the early 90s that was very well funded, and they used all of the traditional advertising, public service announcements through radio, billboards, school curriculums, transit ads, all of that traditional marketing. And in the evaluation, they found that in the years prior to the campaign, only about 7% of American adults knew that they should be eating 5 servings of fruits and vegetables per day. In the years following the campaign, that rose to 20%. So that's a pretty substantial increase in knowledge about the program and what they should be doing. They also measured people's self-reported behaviors. And in the years prior to the campaign, only about 11% reported that they were actually eating 5 servings of fruits and vegetables per day. And in the years following the campaign, this is not a mistake on my slide, that stayed static at 11%. So despite millions of dollars in advertising and substantially reaching all of these people and increasing their knowledge, they didn't see any increase in actual consumption of fruits and vegetables. So what people, if I could see all of your cameras on right now, that would probably look a little bit like this. It can feel a little disheartening because this is the vast majority of what we do and what we see. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It's fairly efficient to put together an education campaign, to put together a website, a flyer. But I think one of the primary reasons that we continue to do this is that we're sort of lured by the traditional marketing approaches, and we see how effective it is for selling products, for getting people to purchase vehicles or sign up for subscriptions or purchase pharmaceuticals. We're exposed to this every day. It's very familiar. So why wouldn't it work for us? And I think the primary reason is we're not asking people to switch a consumer preference. So if we're working in transportation, you're not trying to get someone to buy a Ford instead of a Chevy. You're trying to get someone to not drive at all, or to purchase a vehicle that's maybe a little bit more, a little bit less convenient. So when we're working on in behaviors related to sustainability, often what we're asking people to do is more difficult, more costly, or somehow less desirable than the alternative. And that requires a different approach or a supplemental approach to traditional marketing. So the framework that I've used, and as Kayla mentioned, for more than 20 years across a wide range of domains, has been community-based social marketing. And really what community-based social marketing is a process. It's a framework that helps you to build programs. It's not a specific strategy by itself. And what has made this so useful is that it's not new. It's been around over 30 years now as a framework, but it's grounded in over 100 years of research in psychology, and most specifically social psychology and environmental psychology, but also other areas. Community-based social marketing is also, not surprisingly, community-based. And by that, I mean that the programs that we're developing are created based on information gathered from the community in which they're going to be delivered, and very often delivered by the community themselves or leveraging social networks within the community. Community-based social marketing focuses also on removing barriers and addressing some of the barriers to action. Knowledge and attitudes are barriers, but it's just two of the barriers to potentially engaging in environmental behaviors. And lastly, community-based social marketing is behavior-based. A lot of thought is given to the behaviors that we're targeting and their potential impact on environmental problems. So I'm going to walk you through just very quickly what the community-based social marketing process is. I'm going to show you a short case study just to give you a sense of, okay, this is how it works. And then we're going to dive deeper through each of the steps, and I'll show you some examples of how this is applied. So this 5-step process begins with selecting a behavior. A lot of thought goes into this because, as you know, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of different behaviors underneath this umbrella of sustainability. We can't give people a list of, here's 1,000 things you can do to protect the environment, please pick something. We know that they're unlikely to do anything. And not all behaviors are created equal. Not all behaviors have the same importance or urgency or impact. We also know that the tools that we will ultimately use, or the strategies, can vary depending on the behavior that we picked. So whether it's a one-time behavior or a repetitive behavior or has the opportunity to become a habit, these are all things we want to think about at the very beginning. Once we've selected a behavior, we conduct research to learn about what are the barriers that decrease the likelihood that people will engage in the action, and what would the audience perceive as beneficial? What would motivate that audience to participate? Sometimes what the audience perceives as beneficial is different than the reason for doing our program, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. Once we have a good understanding of what behavior or behaviors we want to target and what are the underlying barriers and benefits, the strategies become pretty easy to develop. They almost always self-present themselves because that foundational work will guide us to this sort of the tools that are most relevant. And I'll share some of those with you as well. Finally, we want to pilot test our strategies on a small scale to ensure that they're effective and also scalable before we roll them out across the entire community. So that is, in a nutshell, the community-based social marketing framework. I think the best way to really understand that flow, though, is to walk you through a simple case study. So this is, I chose this one because at some point we've probably all run into this behavior before in our own communities, neighborhoods, or workplaces. So this was a project that I did for the city of Oceanside many years ago now. The city of Oceanside is the northernmost city in San Diego County in California. So we're right along the coast. So therefore, water quality is a pretty big issue. And for this particular project, they were concerned about bacteria that was in the San Luis Rey River, which runs directly into the Pacific Ocean. Along the river is a trail that's available for residents and visitors to use for walking and biking, and it runs about 7 miles inland all the way to the coast. And so they're concerned about the bacteria in that water. One of their hypotheses there was that one of the contributors to bacteria was pet waste. So people just leaving pet waste along the trail when they're out walking their dogs. And we know that pet waste does carry a lot of bacteria, but we wanted to make sure, is this really a problem? Because we know we can kind of pay attention to those things that we care about. If you're someone that's working in public safety, you're going to notice everybody that's not wearing a bike helmet. If you're someone that works on water quality, you're going to notice every instance. So we wanted to make sure we started by making sure that was the right behavior. And so we conducted systematic observations out on the trail to make sure that this actually was a significant problem. And so we partnered with a Girl Scout organization and we sent them out and they counted piles of pet waste along the trail. And we established, in fact, there was a significant problem with pet waste left behind on the trail. But we also needed to know who is responsible. And because that was going to tell us the audience for our campaign. So was this people coming from all over the city? or just were they tourists, or are they people who are living close to the trail? So again, using our partner, we conducted intercept surveys with people who had their dogs out on the trail, and we asked them to provide us with their cross streets. And we learned that most of the people coming to the trail with their dogs were coming from the neighborhoods immediately adjacent to the entry points to the trail. That told us exactly where our program needed to be and who our target audience was. So then, as is often the case, our client said, well, we already know what to do. We already know we need to tell people it's the law, and we need to make them care about the water quality, and we need to tell them it's bad for children's health, and we just need to put all this information out. And so they wanted to proceed with signage that looks a lot like what you see here and what you probably see all over, at least in North America. And it highlights what, these benefits that were important to the city, the law, the disease, and it doesn't really actually make picking up pet waste look that pleasant either. Most of these individuals are hunched over. Some of them don't even have the proper equipment. So we slowed them down and we said, okay, well, that's possible. These might be motivating, but let's ask the audience. Let's understand. And what we found out through a mail survey was that most people didn't really care that it was the law. They didn't believe that it would be actually enforced. The things that they found most motivating were a social responsibility, kind of doing the right thing as a dog owner. And the primary barriers were simply that the trash cans were too far away on the trail and that they would forget a bag. So they would leave their home to go walk their dog in the morning or in the afternoon, and oops, I left my bag at home. And so knowing those barriers and knowing what was important to the audience, it made it really easy for us to come up with a strategy that directly addressed those. So to address the audience motivation, we created new signage that focused on social responsibility with that do your duty. We made it look easy and pleasant to do. And we also included the secondary benefit that was preventing water pollution. Being so close to the ocean, that was a shared value of the target audience. Now, enhancing motivation isn't enough. We also needed to take a look at those barriers. And so more trash cans were installed along the trail, including bag dispensers for picking up waste. We then pilot tested that by installing this new infrastructure in certain sections of this trail and not in others. We just left alone as a control area and sent those Girl Scouts back out to pick up piles of pit waste and count them. And what we found was that while the control group, the amount of pet waste stayed the same, we saw a significant reduction. It was actually 23% reduction in piles of accumulated waste over the course of that pilot. So that told us that it was what we did likely that led to that reduction rather than just maybe fewer people being out or some other seasonal change. So that's ultimately the way community-based social marketing works. And I know that's a really simple example, but as you can see, it's very evidence-based throughout, and the decisions you make at step one carry over to the next. So I'm going to dive a little bit deeper now into each of the steps and tell you a little bit more about what goes on. The first is selecting behaviors. And this is actually something that we spend a lot of time on, and I think it is one of the most valuable aspects here because there are so many different behaviors that you could target, but we have to be really strategic about it. So the first thing that we do is define the outcome. What is it that you're trying to achieve? And that is essentially, what is the environmental problem you're trying to address? And I've included just 5 here, but there could be many here. Are you trying to reduce bacteria in a water body, reduce waste going to the landfill, reduce CO2 emissions? What is it that ultimately that you're trying to impact? It's critical to define that at the beginning. Once you've done that, the second thing, just as we did with figuring out who's not picking up after their pet, we want to figure out who is contributing most to that problem. So if we were trying to reduce water use in San Diego, we would look at, well, who's using the most water? And if we look at data from San Diego, we see that most of that is in the residential sector. And breaking that down even further, we see that most of the residential water use is actually outdoor water use, 53%. So that kind of tells us where the most important behaviors are that we might target with our program. You can see that there's lots of other behaviors, but they're less of an impact. So if we were to deliver a campaign just on taking shorter showers, that's going to impact overall water use much less than targeting behaviors related to outdoor irrigation. So we're really trying to be strategic, making sure that we're picking behaviors that are meaningfully linked to that environmental problem. Once we've done that, we can begin to list all of those different behaviors. So what are the different behaviors related to outdoor water use? There's repairing leaks in irrigation, replacing irrigation systems, replacing turf with native plants. The list goes on and on. As we list those, we want to be very specific. That's essentially what I mean by non-divisible. If you were to say reduce water or reduce energy or recycle, those are divisible actions, meaning you could divide that into much more specific actions. We also want to make sure we're not listing strategies. So a behavior like attend a workshop or visit a website, those are strategies. They're actions that people take that you hope will ultimately lead them to the behavior, but they don't ultimately impact the behavior by itself. So when we're listing those behaviors, we really want to make sure that we're not listing strategies. And when we have still a long list, maybe it's just 2 or 3 actions that we've settled on, but maybe it's 100. In the case of residential energy efficiency, there's well over 200 things that you could do in your home to save energy. So when that's the case, in a final step, we take some time to prioritize those actions. And 4 factors that we consider in doing that are impact. That is, we want to pick behaviors that are impactful on the outcome, the higher impact behaviors. But we also want to look at adoption. To what extent are people already doing it? We're looking for behaviors that have relatively low rates of adoption because we need some room to move. If it's just a few people that just aren't doing it, we may be better coming at that with policy changes or regulatory changes later on. So we're really looking for behaviors that have a high impact, but also some room to move. We also want behaviors that have a high degree of probability. That is, we can change that behavior with our resources. We have some control or there's some existing level of motivation. And then lastly, we're looking for behaviors that have broad applicability. Is this something that's only relevant to a small portion of the population, or is it more broadly relevant across the community? And so in the course, I go into this more in depth, but there's a strategy for collecting information around each of these factors and bringing them all together to make strategic decisions about what behaviors to move forward with in your programs. So a lot goes into that step. I spend a lot of time talking about it because it is a lot, but if you choose the wrong behavior, you're not likely going to have an impact on that environmental outcome, and that's the most important. So if you pick an audience that's not linked to the problem, or you picked a behavior that's not linked to the problem meaningfully, then ultimately we're not really making any progress. And as you all know, many of these issues are very critical and urgent. So once you've done that work to narrow down to the most important behaviors to focus on, we then can conduct research with the audience to understand the barriers and the benefits. And so by barriers, I mean anything that can decrease the likelihood that people will engage in the behavior. And that might be something that is internal to the individual, like general motivation, or I don't want to be perceived as weird. I don't want to be the first one to try it. Or they can actually be structural elements of the environment, external things that people don't have control over. So the distance to a household hazardous waste facility, for example, or the lighting along a street where you may want people to be walking or biking. We also want to understand the benefits. And here, as I mentioned before, we're interested in what is the audience motivation. Sometimes that's different than the purpose for the program. So purpose for the program may be to reduce CO2 emissions through walking and biking, but the audience motivation may be more related to their own personal health or maybe social benefits associated with doing that. So we really need to understand where the audience is. Also at this step, there's an acknowledgement that the barriers can vary at the level of individual behaviors. So the reason that somebody doesn't recycle their paper might be different and is different than the reason they may not recycle their food scraps correctly. So barriers exist at the level of individual actions, and they can also vary by audience, season, they can change over time, and across other contexts. To understand the audience, we use all of the traditional research methods. We begin always with literature reviews, learning about what have others uncovered in this space, working with a similar behavior. We can conduct observations, focus groups, interviews, and then all of the traditional surveys as well. But the important thing is that we're gathering information from the target audience and not building our programs based on hunches. Having that understanding of where the barriers and benefits are is critical for moving to that third step. And I will say in my 20 years, where most agencies like to start is at the third step. Let's just jump into developing the strategy. We don't have time for all that other work. But I can also say that once you've done that initial work, it really becomes clear what you need to do in terms of developing a strategy. I borrowed this from Wes Schultz, who's my mentor and another instructor through the program. But I think this is a really good way to conceptualize how we think about barriers and benefits. And generally, you're going to find yourself in different scenarios with barriers relative to benefits. So at the top there, you'll see that we've got pretty high barriers and some existing level of motivation. That's the arrows forward. If all we do is try to raise motivation, it's going to be really hard to overcome those barriers. So when that's the case, when you have really high barriers, the behavior is inconvenient or unpleasant or expensive, we're going to do what we can to bring those barriers down as much as possible. At the bottom, we have that other scenario where the barriers generally aren't really that high. Picking up after your dog, putting something in the recycling bin. There, we're going to focus more heavily on motivation because we're never going to be able to get rid of all of the barriers. So understanding where people are can kind of start helping us to guide us to the right tools and the right strategies, which is usually where people ask, what strategies do we use? What's the right message? Well, it depends. It depends on that context that you find yourself in. So I'm going to just quickly introduce you to some of the most popular tools that we use. The three that generally are used to remove barriers are information and education, convenience, and prompts. So I mentioned at the beginning, knowledge is rarely enough to motivate people to engage in behaviors, but knowledge can be a barrier. People need to know what items go in a recycling bin. They need to know what household hazardous waste materials are accepted at their local facility. They need to know the hours that the transit is available and the costs. So when knowledge is a barrier, that's definitely a program, and it's almost always an element of every program. It's also appropriate if the program is new or if there's been a change to an existing program. So for example, in California, we maybe have been taking our yard waste out to the curb for years, but now in most jurisdictions, you can also put your food waste out there. So that's a new behavior that in education is completely appropriate. Convenience is also a very popular tool. Anytime you can make the behavior easier for people to do, you increase the likelihood that they will participate. So conveniently located trash and recycling bins makes it easier for people to properly dispose of their waste. But we can also find ways to make the undesired behavior harder. So in this example, they've created a slot for paper, making it harder for you to put things like food containers or beverage bottles into that paper. So we always want to think about how we can make it easier, but how can you make it harder for them to do the thing you don't want them to do, like single occupant driving, for example. Finally, the other barrier that comes up a lot is simply, I forget to do it. I have a habit of doing it this way, and it's really hard for me to remember. When the primary barrier is forgetting, a visual or auditory reminder can be really helpful, and we call these prompts. They're mostly used for repetitive actions, and the idea is that we're reminding people to engage in the behavior until that becomes a habit or until they've created a new routine. When placing prompts, we place them close in space and time to where that behavior is going to occur. So right on the recycling bin, for example, or if you want to remind someone to turn off the lights, we do that right next to the light switch. We had a program where we wanted people to wash their clothes in cold water, and we found that most of the washing machines were defaulting to warm settings. So we created a prompt to remind people that they needed to switch to cool. reminding people what items go into their food scraps collection bins, or if there's particular problematic items in recycling, we might remind them right there, if you have this item, this is the bin that it goes in. So a lot of different ways you can use prompts. Another way that we use prompts is by pairing the action that we want to remind people to do with something that they're already doing. So in this program, we wanted to remind people to check their irrigation systems for leaks, yet their irrigation systems were running in the middle of the night. So we created a program in which we reminded people to check their irrigation systems while they were mowing their lawn. We learned in our audience research that they were mowing their lawn on a weekly basis. And so we wanted to link those two actions together. So those are just three of the strategies we have for removing barriers. There are others that I talk about in my class, but those are my three favorite. And so I'll move now to talk about two of the most common tools we use to enhance motivation. And again, there's many more tools at our disposal, but these are two of not only the most common, but also two of the most powerful tools that we have. So one is commitment, essentially asking people to sign a pledge or verbally say that they will do something. Commitments are pulled from research on self-perception. And the idea is that when you've made a commitment to do something, by writing it down, by saying it, by participating in it, it changes the way that we see ourselves. And our future actions are likely to be in line with it. And so in general, we don't spend time on things or say we're going to do things that we don't already think are important. So we can leverage that self-perception through commitments. Additionally, it's considered a positive character trait to be consistent between what we say we're going to do and our follow-through actions. And so we can leverage that human desire for consistency as well by making those commitments public. Because commitments sort of require people to already see this as part of something they think is important, we generally use this for an audience that is already motivated. They already have supportive attitudes, but we just need to move them the rest of the way. When using commitments, whenever possible, we make these written, public, and durable, meaning someone has taken the time to write it down, it's posted publicly, and it's going to be there for a while. So research on commitments has shown that those are three of the situations in which commitments are most effective. And we can use them in different ways. A colleague of mine at the Houston Zoo did an excellent study that got commitments from from anglers on fishing piers to recycle their monofilament fishing line before leaving the pier. So they had their photos taken, they made a commitment, and those went up at a kiosk right at the entrance to the fishing piers. In my work, we've used commitments with youth to remind them to pick up trash before leaving a skate park. We found that the youth were most motivated by keeping their park clean, and they would simply forget to throw their trash away before they left. So we had them sign commitments. Those went up on a board, but then also a reminder of their commitment went on their skate helmets or boards so that others could see that their peers were committed. So the second tool that we use for enhancing motivation is social norms. Humans are social creatures, and we look to others to guide our own behaviors, particularly when the behavior is uncertain, when we're not sure what we're going to do. There are different types of norms. And one type of norm, a descriptive norm, is kind of what are other people doing? There are also injunctive norms. What do other people approve of doing? So those are the two most powerful norms that we draw from. And we know that people use that information about what other people care of and what other people are doing to guide their own behavior, even if they don't already care about the behavior. So this is a tool that we often use if motivation is low and we need to elevate that. It's also a very powerful tool. It can sort of happen without you knowing it. We tend to go with the group, even if the group is doing the wrong thing. So because of that, when we're using social norms as a strategy, we want to make sure that we're highlighting behaviors that are desired or in the right direction. So we might highlight that through text, highlighting that in this case, over half of your neighbors say they're already using mostly cold water for their laundry. That's not something you would see because people are doing it in their privacy of their homes, but we can make that norm public through testimonials and advertising that information. We can also leverage social norms by showing people where their behavior compares to the behavior of others. We find that if people are performing less well than others that are like them, they will change their behavior to align with the behavior of the group. We can also highlight people's approval of the behavior. Sometimes the behavior is new, and so there isn't a strong descriptive norm to follow. Nobody else is doing it yet. When that's the case, we will have messages that highlight people's approval. So in this case, it was a new food waste collection program. So we highlighted the fact that 79% believed it was important to reduce the amount of waste going to the landfill. We can also highlight change or movement toward a norm with more and more people coming on board, which we also did with this program. Finally, another way that you can convey a social norm is by grouping commitments together. So this was a program where we got commitments from homeowners to use alternative methods of pesticide or pest control at their homes that did not impact water quality. And so by grouping the commitments of others, it not only we get that benefit of altering people's self-perceptions or highlighting their self-perception, but also that social pressure of other people like me who shop at this store, who come to this gardening center, are also committing to do this. So finally, I'll wrap us up here in just a minute so I have plenty of time for questions. We have all of these tools available to us, but if people don't pay attention to the messages that we create, all of that work before it is sort of lost. So we also spend a lot of time talking about how to effectively communicate with the audience. And we could talk for hours just on this, but two of the points that I really like to make. And first is that the closer we can get to in-person or personalized communication, the more effective we are likely to be. So even though we can reach a lot of people through social media, through mass media, TV, radio, those traditional methods, the behavior change associated with that is likely to be low. Whereas if you have a conversation with your neighbor, a friend, a family member, colleague, behavior change is more likely to result. And that doesn't always have to be your program personnel going out and talking to people one-on-one. A lot of times we can leverage conversations that are already happening, retail partnerships, for example, or we can personalize communication, tailoring communication to specific households or community members. And then the second piece is really just making sure that we're using appropriate value frames. I mentioned this before, but often the reason for delivering your program doesn't align with what the audience perceives as beneficial. And some work we did in San Diego County with rural residents, the primary focus of the program was protecting the water quality of the Pacific Ocean. Well, there's a lot of people in San Diego that don't live anywhere near the ocean. Where they live is mountains and fields, and so they're not so concerned about whether or not they're going to be able to surf that weekend, but they are concerned about being able to use their yards. So in those communication materials, we're leading with that, their ability, keeping their yards clean, the creeks and lakes and beaches were secondary to that. So finally, the last thing I'll say is it is important to pilot test any strategies that you deliver. We want to make sure they're effective, but also cost effective. A lot of times pilot testing is skipped because it seems like, well, it's just going to add to the cost of the program. But if you find that the strategies aren't working, then the return on investment of your program is basically zero. So these pilots are typically very brief, just a week or two, or just long enough for the behavior change to happen to give us some evidence that it's working, or maybe we need to fine tune it before going further. And it can be very, very useful in planning your scale up of the intervention. If you find that you'll find that one strategy is not that much different than doing nothing or just doing education alone, then you might move forward with a different program. So you can figure out not only is it effective, but what is the cost associated with getting that behavior change. So taking the time to do a pilot test in the long term can ultimately save you program dollars, because you're only going to move forward with those programs that are most cost effective. So that is community-based social marketing. I do talk about this framework in my class in much more detail. So I'm going to pause now and take any questions that y'all may have.
Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was phenomenal. I can tell you do this for a living every single day, which is one of the things that I really love about UCSD's programs is we actually have like real life professionals teaching our courses. So thank you so much for your presentation. There were a couple of questions that came up, which I thought were really exciting. I'm going to kind of go from the bottom up. So one of the questions was about from a Raymond Belmonte, I believe is how you say it, says, are we finding that commitments are effective at making behavior change stick long term?
Yeah, it depends. So, one of the challenges that I find with my field is that, and I think in the field in general, is that very often we're not measuring behavior on the long term. So, we conduct the pilots, it changed behavior, and we don't know, did it persist or not? So increasingly in my work, I'm including efforts to try to have more evaluation. So can you include some 1 or 2 follow-up measures, 2 weeks out, 4 weeks out, a year out, to see if that behavior persisted? And if it didn't, why not? Right? Are there other barriers at play, or do you need to do something else to help distill or help to solidify is the word I'm looking for, solidify habits. And so if a behavior is repetitive, it's probably going to be more than just a commitment. We're going to include feedback and rewards and other and ongoing reminders to make sure that we've formed a solid habit. If behavior is one time replacing an appliance, then the commitment, if it gets them there, we don't, that's it. It gets them there and they've done the behavior. So, commitments may be better for some behaviors than others, but we always want to pilot test and to the extent possible, measure that going out. Yeah.
Great point. Great point. The evaluation, very, very important. Alrighty. We do have a question, and I would really love your answer to this, just to kind of get it settled for once and for all. I've heard this question so many times in my courses. How well does shame work when it comes to this type of thing? Specifically calling someone out on the fact that they're not doing the behavior you want them to do. In this example, it was like perhaps putting a sticker on the organic spoon if it's been contaminated.
So my understanding of this literature is that it's a little bit mixed, that people do have this finite pool of worry. How many things can we make them feel bad about before they shut down, right? And so I think my perspective is that shame can work, but is it really the best tool? Or can we get there by leveraging more positive emotions like community goals and community self-efficacy, or changing social norms and things, and really playing on people's more intrinsic motivation or their values, and saving shame for those things in our society that truly are shameful, right? Because there are some big society ills that, we probably want to make people feel really bad about doing those things. Putting something in the wrong recycling bin, I don't know that we want to use that tool for that. That's my perspective. I think we have a lot of other really powerful tools in our toolbox. And if we do this work of understanding the audience and what motivates them, we don't need to go there with the shame. So that's my perspective.
That's a really good point. Thank you, Jennifer. All right. So this next one, I think it's going to be exciting to hear your answer about this, because you've been doing this for so long now. I'm sure you've seen a change in the way that we're using different technologies in the implementation of this approach. The question specifically is from Jessica about how can we best leverage AI to help with resource constraints, right? Like not everybody has money to do the big dive into the research. So for example, to help with literature reviews, is there a way to use AI to help with some of these more labor intensive pieces of the CBSM process?
Yeah. So, in terms of using AI for research, this is actually a really rapidly changing field. I just got back from a conference of the American Association of Public Opinion Research, and there are big minds from like Gallup organization and other large NIH and others really working on figuring this out. So I'll tell you what I know now. And what I know now is that AI can be effective for some things. It's being used pretty successfully for, say, coding qualitative answers. So taking a script or transcription from a focus group and coding those responses, or coding open-ended survey responses. People are using AI to create surveys, yet they still are needing to test the surveys, right? There definitely are limits to AI. In terms of literature reviews, most of what I've heard is that it's not good. I've had this experience on my own. It'll cite an article, and this article doesn't even exist. So I would definitely steer away from literature reviews. It might be a good sense to kind of give you an outline of what's out there, some issues to think about, but I would really caution against using AI as a replacement for hearing from your audience. So coding, yes, data analysis, I think there's some things that it can help with there to save us time, but replacing the research or replacing talking with people, I would say absolutely not. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a really, really good point. Okay. Let's see. So here was a really good one about social norms. Do we have to be careful about who we're selecting to use when we are talking about social norms?
Yes. So, yeah. So one of the things that I talk about more in my course is, who do we compare people to? And so when we are providing people with information about what other people are doing, to the extent possible, we want to make sure we're providing that information about people who are as similar as possible to the person you want to change, right? So other people in your community who are like you, who live in similar types of homes. That's important, but it's more important that it's not an out group, as someone that you might see separate from yourself, right? So, being in San Diego, if you provided someone with a norm that came out of San Francisco, well, San Francisco is different. Southern California is different than Northern California. I'm not like them. They're not. So you really want to think about presenting the normative information from what we would call a close referent group.
Yeah, that kind of gets to this next question about what are the considerations about social norms in different cultural systems. So I'd assume that that's more about, are we using one social norm for one cultural system and approaching, applying it to another? Are we being careful about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think we always want to be careful about any of these tools and how they might be received in different cultural contexts. How social norm works um, well, they work really well in individualistic societies like the US when you think that they wouldn't, right? And they could work stronger in other areas that are more collectivistic. But I would caution always against picking up a tool that works here and just plopping it down somewhere else that has really different cultural rules or expectations. Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, Jennifer. Well, we've got a couple of minutes left, and I do want to ask, there's some questions in here I know that are very deep and would probably be covered in your course, right? Like that is kind of the point of the course, is to go a little bit deeper. Can you just tell us a little bit more in your own words about what the biggest, most valuable or most exciting to you difference is between what you presented today and then what you present in your course?
Yeah. I think it's the application. So what I've found is nobody comes out of a degree program with a degree in community-based social marketing. They have different elements, right? And even my own staff here, nobody really knows how to do it until they start doing it. And that's when it really seals in. So this probably feels like a lot like drinking out of a fire hose. Like, it's so much information and it might be a lot different than how you've been traditionally approaching things. So through the class, I like to introduce it in phases. So first, we're talking about, how do you go through this process of narrowing down a behavior? How do you really think about that? how do you do research? What might that look like? And then how might you apply these different tools to this particular behavior, and kind of just following one behavior change all the way through? How would you conduct a pilot test with this audience? There's different ways that you would go about doing that. What would you measure? It kind of depends what you're trying to change. So I think by getting doing the application and then getting feedback on that throughout the process is where it really kind of sinks in. That was true for me. I learned this through my very first community-based social marketing project, what I think was like 2002, 2003. And just, repeat over and over again. I'm still learning, but as I apply to different behaviors and different audiences,
You do learn.
that's the most exciting.
Well, thank you so much for your insight today, Jennifer. And I'm going to pass this back to Stefania if you want to wrap us up. And thank you to everybody who asked questions. If you didn't get your questions answered, join us in class, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of opportunity for answering questions then.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I want to thank our speakers, Jennifer, Kayla, our moderator, and everybody who attended this webinar today. We definitely hope it was insightful and it was a good use of your time, and that you're inspired now to leave, to learn and do better. As a reminder, as Kayla mentioned, we do offer our sustainability and behavior change certificate classes on a quarterly basis. So you can take classes as frequently as 4 times per year. We just launched our summer quarter 2 days ago. So classes are open for enrollment right now. Lots of information is available on the website and is always up to date. And I'm always happy to connect with anyone who would like to learn more. We had a question about the recording, and yes, we will be following up with an email, probably in a week or so, with the recording of the webinar and details about the certificate. So be on the lookout for that. And then we do have our next webinar of the series that will take place on September 24th, same time at noon. And we'll feature our very own Kayla Cranston as the guest speaker. And Wes will be our moderator, I believe. And I'll share more about that in the email as well. So again, thank you so much for all of your time and for sharing so much knowledge. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And thank you for being with us today.